Welcome to the Catbird Quilts. I'm Kathy Martin, and in today's quilt story, I'm going to tell you the whole arc of the 9-patch Trip Around the World quilt. And you know I have a lot to say about it, so stay with me. You may have noticed in these first 10 seconds of this video that this loveliness is not a 9-patch Trip Around the World quilt. There's a reason for that. It's because this is not the quilt. This is the inspiration quilt for the quilt that I made that's right here behind me. It all started, this is going to be a very long video. No, hopefully not. It all started when I got an Instagram message from my cousin's daughter, and I have already forgotten what that makes her to me, and a lot of you know that and put it in the first video that I made about this, and I should have checked it, but I didn't. So anyway, her name is Brittany. So Brittany messaged me, and she had been following me on Instagram and seeing the quilts that I was making, and she said, "Your quilts remind me of Mimi quilts, and would you consider making me one?" And so Mimi is my grandmother and Brittany's great-grandmother, and we loved Mimi. She was really, really wonderful person. I credit her with my love for gingham. And she made this quilt. Of course, I told Brittany, yes, I'd be happy to make her quilt. And at the time, we had a lot going on. My older daughter's graduation and just a whole lot. At the time, I think I only had 3 whips in the works. Now I have like 13, and I'm less stressed than I was then, but you know how that goes. So kind of put it on the back burner, called my sister who had this quilt at her house and said, "Can I borrow the Mimi quilt so that I can get inspiration?" And she was like, "Of course, keep it as long as you want." So this is the quilt that kind of started my journey on this quilt story. So if you saw the first video about this quilt, it was back in several months ago, November of 2022, I believe. And that's when I actually started on this process. And I studied it. And the thing about this, it's a true not 9-patch, goodness gracious. It's a true Trip Around the World quilt. So it's not multiple little trips around the world all sewn together. It's one, you can tell, it's one big concentric diamonds, which is not a thing. It starts and just works out and works out and works out. And the thing about that is so great is it's very visually stunning. And my grandmother did it really masterfully, honestly, because there are very few repeating colors or fabrics, but she did them in such a way where she mixed prints and solids. And because of that, it's not too busy. It is busy, but I don't think it's too busy. And she handled her fabric colors really well. And so it's really pretty, but it is hard to imagine how to make it. And really what it comes down to is you can do it in 4 quadrants, but you have to know the whole in every single fabric in every single order and cut all the pieces and have it all essentially laid out before you ever start sewing the first pieces together. And for those of us that are part-time quilters and do a little here and a little there, it's kind of a hard pattern to do in the part-time quilter way. I really just spent some time looking at it, studying it, and arrived on the conclusion that I would do it instead of doing this, each row is a completely different fabric. I would make the Trip Around the World, but with 9 patches. So instead of this one center red square, it would be this square, the center part would be a 9-patch block. And then the next row would be 4 9-patch blocks together, and then so on and so forth. So instead of a single fabric making up each ring of the trip, it would be a series of 9 patch blocks sewn together. It really took me a few months even just to get my head wrapped around it. And I encourage you to watch that original video if you want to see how I composed it. I won't do that here. For those of you that have joined me on Patreon, or if you want to join me on Patreon, I'm going to make the pattern that I made for the 9 patch trip around the world quilt into a PDF form and make that available to my patrons. So if you would like to join me there, that would be one of the perks. But it took me a little while to get my head wrapped around how I wanted to do it. And then I did, and then I had to choose fabrics and so on and so forth. So I'm going to put this away with one last look at my Mimi's wonderful work. For those of you that might be interested, she machine pieced some of this. Some of it is hand pieced, but it is hand quilted. And this quilt was on my parents' bed for a lot of my life. And so I have a lot of fond memories of sitting on my mom's bed while she was ironing or talking or getting ready to go somewhere, and then just kind of enjoying all the variation in this trip around the world. So I'm going to put it away, get out the actual quilt that this story is about, and I'll be right back. So here it is. This is Brittany's 9 patch trip around the world Mimi tribute quilt, which is a whole mouthful. I have to tell you, I am just happy as a lark about this quilt, and it has been a long time in the making, obviously. As we're filming, it's June of 2023, so whatever that is, November, December, January, February, March, April, May, June. Don't ask me, I had to do that on my fingers. It's been about 8 months, maybe 9. Most of these fabrics, if you're curious, are shirts. There are some notable exclusions. The very center yellow fabric is thatched by someone, Moda Fabrics. I'm sorry, I don't remember the designer. This kind of funky one that's the blend between the yellow and the orange linen is hand-me-down fabric from my sister's co-worker's attic. And she's a friend. So thank you, Amy, for this fabric. She just had a fabric stash that she wasn't using, gave it to me, and I loved that fabric and incorporated it. Surprisingly, the hot pink, this kind of lipstick color, the plum, the persimmon color, that's that blend between the orange linen and the bright pink, are all men's shirts. They are 100% cotton men's shirts. So there's some linen in here. The navy is a shirt. This that I wasn't sure whether it was navy or black, it's navy, was a pair of pajama pants, which is great. One of my favorite fabrics in this quilt is this kind of medium blue. It's actually a slightly lighter blue with paisley and almost like a paisley and a floral mix. This turquoise gingham, this grass green plaid is a shirt, and then the other, and the forest green at the very edge is also a shirt. The other one that's not is this green woodland scene with little girls climbing in trees and swinging and flowers, and I think there's a cat in a tree. That was the backing from my older daughter's graduation quilt, and I had a lot of it left over, and so it seemed like an obvious choice. And Brittany has been she is a teacher. She hasn't been a teacher. She is a teacher of, I want to say, kindergarten and early school age, and so that's her gift and her skill, and it seemed like it was a wonderful thing to integrate. So that's the colors and the fabrics. My youngest helped me narrow it down, of course. You should have seen our living room floor. I had not actually broken down the shirts when we chose these. So when we picked the fabric, there were shirts laid out all across our living room floor. And we just wanted it to really, really be reflective of what Mimi had done. And it was a lot of color. And so here we are with a lot of color. When I started, I did not get all of the background fabric picked out. And I kind of foolishly thought, oh, I've probably got enough of this like slightly off-white, almost cream fabric to cover the whole quilt, which is laughable now because I actually ordered replacement fabric when I ran out and then had to get even more fabric than that. So I did not do my own advice, which is to figure out how much you need and get it all in advance. So they're actually all different background fabrics. And so what I try to do, you start on these projects and you think you've got it licked, and then you get into it and it's like, oh, I'm out of that fabric. So what I did is I started with the lightest one in the center, and I used it in concentric rings. And then when it looked like I was going to run out, I got the next fabric and tried to do the pieces in such a way that the background that had been kind of feathers in, and then the background that's going to be takes over. And then in the end, I settled on a off-white background fabric. That's the name of the fabric was Make Time. And I love it. It's little pixels, little white pixels on an off-white background. And that whole line of fabrics, by the way, if you want to look it up, it is so cool because it's about sewing, making time for sewing. So there's a whole line with like the little quilting pins and this pixelated, and then there's something with, I think, scissors and spools. Anyway, I digress. Got it all done. And the way I put it together is a little non-traditional. I actually worked from the center out because that's what made sense to me since I made 9 patch blocks. And I just did the whole entire quilt that way. So I started with the yellow block, and then I made the 9 patch blocks that have that funky print, and I sewed these 3 together, and then I did the orange linen and then made that square. And then every time I added a color, I would do a row, attach it to the square, do a column, attach it to the square, do another row. So I really sewed this quilt. It really was like a trip around the world for me, but I started in the center and worked out. I have noticed trip around the world quilts, I think, are coming back. I've actually seen some other great quilters do trip around the world quilt videos, but they are a lot of times the ones where it's several different small trip around the world quilts, not quilts, trip around the world blocks sewn together. And I still love it. I still think it's great. It wasn't what I wanted to do. So if you were wanting to make a trip around the world quilt and you felt like that was maybe more than you wanted to take on, this is actually a really enjoyable way to go about it, because you're really just making 9 patch blocks in all different colors, and then you can really attach them how you want. So I could have done all of my blocks and then made it as a quadrant, if that makes any sense. So I could have made this section right here, stopped just short of that centerpiece, and then added those in. But for some reason, the way my brain works, it just made sense to start from the inside and work out. I have to say, I don't think I've worked with this many solids. In my previous quilts, I have used solids, but this has fewer prints and more solids, and it was really kind of nice for a change. And every time I would get to a new color, I would think, gosh, it's hard to believe that's a shirt. So anyway, got the quilt top done, was feeling great about myself, and then had to figure out what to do about the quilting. So my buddy Kyle, who I have known from childhood, who did the Copaway quilt and the Celtic Crossing quilt for me, we had talked about his doing another project for me. The last one we did, we had some communication gaps and I did not put things in his favor. So this time did a little better job of communicating with my long arm quilter. And I had this idea for a quilt design and I wasn't sure it could even be done, but I drew out on graph paper what I had imagined. And you'll be able to see the texture. I'm not sure if you can see the actual design, but it started in the center with like an orange peel and then a hump and then an orange peel and then a hump. And then hump is not the right word, but that's what it is. Clamshell? I don't know, but it's a hump. That's what it is. Paul is laughing behind the camera. It's a hump. It's just dome. Mound is worse. Dome. So it's an orange peel and then a dome and then an orange peel and then a dome around that 9 patch. And then when you go out, the orange peel continues and then the domes are in between. So the orange peel starts at the center and goes out to the corners. And then in between is a little dome that points the apex of the dome points away from the center, no matter which quadrant you're in. So these are all humped that way, and these are all humped this way. I know. I hope we leave all of this in because I hope you're dying laughing by now. But anyway, so what it does is it creates almost like a flower, like a gigantic flower or like a mom effect. So it's all these like petals coming off the center, and then across the diagonal through the middle is a little orange peel. And I have to tell you, I love it. Now, I did not know what I was asking Kyle to do, which is often the case when he was trying to figure out the best way to do the actual quilting, which let me just tell you, again, hats off to the long arm quilters out there. My brain does not work that way. The fact that it's like a continual line, no ma'am, or no sir, I don't get it. But somehow he got it. I gave it to him on a graph paper drawing, and he played with the design in his mind of how to do it. And what he actually did, which for some of you, you're going to be like, oh my goodness, if you know how long arming works. He did it just exactly the way I made it. He started in the center and worked out. And so normally what long arm quilters do is they just do row by row by row by row, and they just roll it and then sew and then roll it and sew. And he wanted it to really have that continual feel, just like if you were drawing a mom on paper and then just go around and around and around. And so he had to roll it up, unroll it, roll it up, roll it again. So he quilted it as a trip around the world. So he had a trip around the world while he was long arming. And I have to tell you, I really love that. I feel like it was probably so much more work. So everybody kind of in your heart say, my goodness, poor Kyle. But he did that. And I love that he kind of really, his way of understanding it was the same way that I understood it. And whether it was easier or harder, I guess, for both of us was irrelevant. It was the way that it made sense to us. And so not only are the pieces, were they done from the center out, so was the quilting. And it's a very natural and organic feel. It does not look or feel like a computer did it. And I do love that about the services of really good long arm quilters. You guys, the artistry there is really amazing. And I like that it has this, I think organic is the right word. It just feels like somebody quilted it because somebody quilted it. And so many thanks to Kyle for that. And he just did a great job. So I'm going to turn it over because everybody, we want to see the backs. We always want to see the back. And in this case, I did something I don't normally do, which is I did a very plain, solid, light colored back. And then we can talk about the binding, and then maybe we'll be done with this story. So pause, not really, don't pause. I'm going to reset, turn it over, and I'll be right back. So here's the back. Now, how did I arrive at this back? Well, two things. This is a sheet from the thrift store. And it was an on-location thrift store haul video. I bought this sheet and it is so soft. I can't even begin to tell you how soft this sheet is. I don't know if it was used for 100 years, but it's not threadbare. So I don't think that's it. I think it was just really soft to begin with. It almost has that peached texture to it. It's just very, very soft. And it was 100% cotton and it was on half off. And so I think I paid maybe $2 for the whole entire thing. And I didn't have to piece it. It's amazing. So when I got the quilt front done, quilt top, which by the way, for all the husbands who are getting rooked into watching these quilt videos with your wonderful wives, if you have the thing that Paul has, why do they call it a quilt top? And then this is called the back instead of the bottom. And it's an excellent question. So it feels like it should either be quilt front and quilt back or quilt top and quilt bottom. But quilt bottom feels weird. So quilt top and quilt back, it's so much more vibrant in real life than you can even imagine. Photos just do not do it justice. But I messaged Brittany. I was like, okay, so the quilt top is done. And now I'm moving on to the backing. I did not do it with, yes, I did do it with that voice in my head. Do you have any opinions about what you want for the quilt back? Which is, I think, there have been projects that I have made for people where I have not recruited their opinions at all. And some of it is, sometimes I know people well enough that I don't have to ask. Sometimes it's, I just know the limitations of what I can do and what's available. And sometimes I have a vision for the backing as I'm doing the top, so I don't recruit or ask for opinions. But in this case, it's very big. And it's also just like every other trip around the world quilt. It's very busy. There's a lot of color. There's a lot of fabric, different fabrics on the top. And before I launched into, buying fabric that tried to tie it all in or whatever, I just messaged her and said, do you have any opinions about this? And she said something along the lines of, no, not really. Just not white. And I had this kind of in mind, and hopefully the color is fairly true. It's kind of a peachy cream. It's not really cream. It's got a little bit of a peachy, yellowy, I don't know what this color is. But it definitely is light, but it's not pure white, which I do use a lot of whites in my quilts. And so I kind of knew I had this in my stash. And she said, I don't really mind, just not white. And so I kind of, how about cream? How about like a peachy cream? She's like, perfect. So that was fantastic. Before Kyle and I made the commitment to work together on this again, I was like, how do you feel about using sheets in the backing? Because I know there are some long arm quilters that don't really love working with sheets as a backing. I've been told it's because sometimes the thread count is very different than the thread count of quilting cottons. And so if it's a very, very, very tight weave, if it's a high thread count, it can pose potentially some problems if the front and the back are not similar. I've also had other long arm quilters that have the attitude of, psh, if you have a sharp needle, doesn't really matter. So I don't know because I don't do that. And so I have no opinion about that. But I did ask, and he was like, oh, yeah, that's fine. That's great. I'll make it work. So I had originally had the idea that I thought it would be neat if the quilt thread for the back was the same color as the binding so that it would stand out against the cream. And Kyle did some kind of test runs and was so very honest with me, like, I'm not sure you want to do that. And it is what I have been told by other long armors. When you have a dark thread on the back and a light thread on the front, or vice versa, you can often see through because the quilting, even if you get the tension just perfect, sometimes that darker thread will be visible from the front. And I did not want it to look perforated on the front. And after thinking and pondering and listening to Kyle's opinion about it, we decided that maybe the best thing to do would be to do the exact thread color of the backing so that all that's left is just texture. And he delivered. He absolutely delivered. I think his ability to do excellent thread choice and his sewing tension is just really impressive and remarkable. So you can probably see the wonderful texture. It's so very soft, and it's kind of a heavy sheet too. So the whole quilt is heavy, which is wonderful in my book. And you can hopefully see maybe how this looks a little bit like a flower that just gets bigger and bigger, or depending on your angle, like right now where I'm sitting, it kind of looks like waves of the ocean. So I guess it's however she wants to look at it. And then the final kind of piece, there's the piecing quilt top, there's the backing, and then there's the binding. And when I started considering the binding with as many colors as there are on the front, I had the, oh no, what do I do with this? And I wanted just to do something that didn't really call attention to the binding itself. Sometimes it's fun to do a fun binding, but it is so bright and happy and vibrant and colorful and busy. I decided that I wanted to just do something solid, and then it was a matter of what solid. And I had the idea, and I think I said this on the last video, I really wanted to do like a caramel color. That's roughly the color of the trees in the little woodland fabric. I couldn't find exactly what I was looking for, but I did stumble upon this cinnamon colored fabric that really is almost perfect with the woodland fabric, even though it wasn't exactly. I was thinking really more like a lighter honey, like just a little more yellow. But in the end, I think that this is just a fantastic color, and it does work with that cream on the back. And most of the colors that it is paired with all along the edge are blues and greens, and then there's this plum right here in the center. Just like a man's wardrobe, I use all these shirts, and sometimes if I have a doubt of what goes with it, I think about, what would a man wear this with? And so if the shirt would go with charcoal gray or dark gray or light gray, then so be it. But a lot of times men wear blue shirts with brown pants, and it usually looks just fantastic. And same with green, and in this case, same with plum. And so I ended up with this brown binding that I think is really nice. And I think it's going to have that frame without calling attention to the binding too much, but just like, it's that thing. It's like it needs to close it up but not be something in and of itself, especially with this much going on the front. So that's where I ended up. And Paul has opinions sometimes about the projects that I make. And one of the things that he said very early on when I started quilting was, well, you know, the binding gets the most use, really. And I thought, what are you talking about? And he took his hands up. He didn't have a quilt in his hand, but I'm sure many of you have had children in your life that like the feel of fabric on their face, especially the edge. And that's where so many of those blankets that have tags and, you know, like that's where your hands go. That's where you feel it. That's what gets pulled. If it's on a bed, that's what gets pulled. And he did that motion just without it. He was like, you know, that's what it's going to get dirty and it's going to get used. And I just have, I mean, I haven't been quilting on that all that long, but I have just never forgot that's what's going to get the use. And that's what's going to get worn and potentially dirty. So I think about that every time. And so now that I think about that, maybe a brown binding is like the perfect, the perfect binding. So if somebody does, now I'm not accusing Brittany of taking her quilt and rubbing it under her nose, but no matter how she and her husband use this in their house, I'm hoping it will hold up well and will be beautiful for a long time. So this is my tribute to Mimi quilt for Brittany. I actually have not put a tag on it. I have intended to and will before I gift it to her, but I did not do that before the video. So it will probably say much what it usually says, which is for Brittany with love from Kathy, and then the date that I finished it. And we'll wash it up and let it get all nubby and crinkly and textural and everything. And then she can take it back with her. And hopefully every time she thinks about it or sees it, she'll think about our Mimi, who we love so much and who is our legacy in quilting. I hope you've enjoyed this lengthy quilt story today. I'm Kathy Martin. This is the Catbird Quilts. Thanks so much for watching.